The sun hung low over the Montana Rockies, painting the peaks in shades of copper and gold. On the weathered porch of a timber cabin, an old man sat with his grandson watching the light fade from the day. Caleb
Jacob, your
Morrison was
pause words
82
carry
years
weight.
old,
You
his
feel
face
that
lined
call?
deep as
Slang
creek
test
beds,
men.
his
Your
hands
time is
gnarled
coming.
from a lifetime of work. His grandson Jacob, barely 17, sat on the porch steps with a canvas rucksack at his feet, ready for the journey that would take him away from these mountains and into a war that felt both distant and inevitable. Jacob had been quiet all afternoon, packing and repacking his things with the nervous energy of a young man trying to appear brave. Caleb had watched him without comment, recognizing in his grandson's movements the same restless fear he'd felt himself at that age. Now, as the evening settled around them, Caleb reached for the words he'd been holding back. "Jacob," he said, his voice still strong despite the years. "Before you leave, there's something I needed to tell you about how a man decides what's worth fighting for." Jacob looked up surprised. His grandfather rarely spoke about the past, preferring to let the mountains and the work teach their own lessons. "This isn't about the Indian Wars," Caleb continued, anticipating the question. "This is about a different kind of battle, about the hardest choice I ever made and the woman who taught me how to make it." The young man turned fully now, settling himself on the steps to listen. Caleb's eyes drifted toward the distant peaks, seeing not the mountains before him, but the ones that existed in memory, sharper and more vivid than any photograph. "It was the fall of 1878, he began. "I was 25 years old, just a few years older than you are now. I lived alone in a cabin not far from here. Didn't trust anyone, didn't want anyone. Then one evening in September, someone knocked on my door." The old man paused, and his grandson could see him traveling back through the decades, returning to a version of himself that existed before marriage, before children, before the weight of all the years between. "And that," Caleb said quietly, "is when everything changed. The present dissolved. The porch, the grandson, the autumn evening of 1935, all faded away. In their place rose a different Montana, younger and wilder, where a solitary man stood at the edge of his world, unaware that in a moment it would expand beyond anything he could imagine. It was twilight in the Montana Territory, late September of 1878. The air carried the first real bite of approaching winter, and the light came at that low angle that made the pine trees cast shadows twice as long as they should. Caleb Morrison stood outside his cabin, a Winchester rifle in the crook of his arm, watching his trapline perimeter with the kind of attention that kept a man alive in country like this. He was younger than 25 and lean as a hunting cat, with dark hair that hung past his collar and a beard he'd stopped trimming months ago. A scar ran along his right wrist, white, and raised a souvenir from a Lakota warrior's knife in a skirmish 6 years past. He wore buckskin pants and a wool shirt that had seen better days, and his boots were resoled twice over because new ones meant a trip to Helena, and Helena meant people. Beside him stood Flint, a wolf dog hybrid with ice blue eyes and a coat the color of storm clouds. The animal had been with him 4 years, since Caleb had found him as a half-starved pup in a winter den. Now Flint stood, rigid hackles raised, a low growl building in his chest. Caleb didn't speak. He simply shifted his grip on the rifle and scanned the tree line to the east. The elk herd that usually grazed in the meadow had scattered an hour ago, and not from a predator. Predators didn't spook a whole herd. Men did. The mountains taught lessons to those who listened. Silence came in two flavors. There was the silence before a storm, when the world held its breath, waiting for the first drops of rain. And there was the silence before violence, when every living thing knew to make itself small and still. This was the second kind. Caleb had checked his eastern trap line that morning and found boot prints he didn't recognize. 3 different sets moving with purpose, not the wandering tracks of lost travelers. They'd been close to his cabin, close enough to see the smoke from his chimney, and that bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Now as the sun touched the western peaks, Flint's ears swiveled forward. The dog's entire body tensed and then relaxed slightly. Not the posture of imminent attack, but of wary observation. Something was coming, and it was alone. Caleb waited. In the mountains, patience was survival. A figure emerged from the pine forest at the clearing's edge, moving with the uncertain steps of someone near the end of their strength. Caleb's finger moved to the trigger guard, not yet on the trigger itself, but ready. Then the figure stepped into better light, and he saw what Flint had already sensed. A woman. Alone. Dressed in the torn remains of a nun's habit, the black fabric mud-stained and snagged with pine needles. Her feet were bare and bleeding. Her dark hair had come loose from whatever arrangement it once held, and now hung in tangles around her face. She carried a small cloth bundle clutched against her chest, like it contained everything she owned, which it probably did. She stopped at the edge of the clearing, swaying slightly. 20 yards separated them, close enough for Caleb to see that her eyes were green even in the failing light, far enough that he could still put a bullet in her if this turned out to be some kind of trick. "Please," she said. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the still air. "I don't mean to intrude. I just need shelter for one night. I can work for it." Caleb didn't lower the rifle. "Nearest mission is 50 miles south. Why aren't you there?" "Because men are hunting me." She said it simply, without drama or pleading, a statement of fact. Men who don't care about habits or vows or anything except what they think I owe them. Flint had stopped growling. The dog took 2 steps forward, nose working the air, then looked back at Caleb with an expression that was almost questioning. The wolf dog had never trusted strangers, had barely tolerated Silas Weatherby, Caleb's only occasional visitor. But something about this woman made the animal curious rather than hostile. Caleb studied her face. He'd learned to read people during his years as an Army scout, and he'd gotten better at it during the years since, when the only visitors to his mountain were men looking for something they had no right to take. This woman had the look he'd seen in soldiers after bad fights. Exhaustion, yes, but underneath it a core of something harder. Determination, the kind that kept you walking when your feet were bleeding and your strength was gone. "Who's hunting you?" he asked. "Men who think I'm property instead of a person." Again, that directness. No elaboration, no appeal to his sympathy, just the truth delivered plain as creek water. She swayed again, more pronounced this time, and her knees started to buckle. She caught herself, but barely. Caleb made a decision he'd probably regret. "Shed behind the cabin has a cot and a stove," he said. "You can stay there tonight. Come morning, you move on." "Thank you." She didn't say anything else. Didn't ask for more, didn't make promises. Just those 2 words delivered with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout. Caleb gestured with the rifle barrel toward the shed, a sturdy structure he'd built for storing pelts and equipment. She walked toward it, each step careful and measured, like someone trying very hard not to fall. Flint trotted alongside her, and Caleb felt a flicker of something that might have been jealousy or might have been relief. The dog was a better judge of character than most people. He watched her reach the shed and disappear inside. A moment later, lamplight flickered in the single window. She'd found the lantern and the matches. Good. That meant she had sense enough to take care of herself. Caleb stood in the gathering dark, rifle still in hand, and wondered what he'd just invited into his carefully ordered world. Every instinct told him to be cautious. The last time he'd trusted someone, she'd promised to marry him, and then proven that promises were just words that sounded pretty until they didn't matter anymore. But he'd also learned that leaving a woman alone in the Montana wilderness at night was tantamount to murder. And whatever else he might have become in his years of solitude, he wasn't that. He walked back to his cabin, secured the door, and set the Winchester in its rack beside his bed. Then he opened his leather ledger, the journal where he recorded each day's events in sparse functional prose. September 10th, 6 beaver, 2 marten. Creek running low. September 11th, check north line. Winter coming early. September 12th, woman arrived, none, running from something. He paused, pen hovering over the page. He'd been about to write one night only, but something made him stop. Instead, he wrote one night, then decide. He closed the ledger and lay down on his cot, fully dressed, the revolver within easy reach. Outside, Flint had positioned himself halfway between the cabin and the shed, as if the dog couldn't quite decide which human needed guarding. Caleb listened to the night sounds, the wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, and underneath it all, silence from the shed. He didn't know it then, but that was the last night he would sleep without worrying about anyone but himself. The gate had opened just a crack, and what came through would change everything. Dawn came cold and clear, the way it always did in the high country. Caleb woke at 5, the habit so ingrained he didn't need the sun to tell him when to rise. He dressed quickly, splashed water on his face from the bucket by the door, and stepped out onto the porch. The smell hit him first. Wood smoke, but not from his own chimney. Someone had lit a fire in the outdoor pit he used for rendering fat and boiling water for the pelts. He stopped, hand automatically moving toward the revolver at his belt, then saw her. The woman had drawn water from the creek, built up the fire, and was now kneeling beside it, tending a battered pot that Caleb had thrown there 3 days ago after burning beans so badly the metal had scorched black. She'd scrubbed it, or was in the process of scrubbing it using sand from the creek bed in determination. She'd changed clothes. Instead of the ruined habit, she wore a pair of his old denim trousers rolled up at the cuffs and a flannel shirt that hung loose on her frame. She must have found them in the shed, probably hanging on a peg where he kept spare work clothes. The shirt was too big, but she'd rolled the sleeves to her elbows and tucked it in well enough. Her hair was pulled back in a simple braid, still damp from washing. Caleb stood there, taking in the scene. She'd also stacked the firewood he'd left in a careless pile, organizing it by size and dryness. The work area around the fire pit looked neater than it had in months. And all of this before sunrise, while he'd assumed she'd still be sleeping off yesterday's exhaustion. She looked up and saw him watching. Didn't startle, didn't stop working. Just met his gaze steadily. "Morning," she said. "I told you dawn. Sun's been up an hour." "I know what you said." She went back to scrubbing. "I'm paying for last night. Unless you want me gone right now, in which case I'll go." It wasn't defiance in her voice. It was something else. A transaction being honored, a debt being acknowledged and settled. She wasn't asking for charity, and she wasn't offering excuses. She was simply doing what needed doing. Caleb descended the porch steps, walked over to the fire. Up close, he could see that her hands, though competent, bore fresh blisters from work they weren't used to. The nun's life might have taught her humility, but it hadn't prepared her for this kind of labor. "Where'd you learn to tend a fire proper?" he asked. "My grandfather had a farm in Oregon Territory. I grew up there until he died." She paused in her scrubbing. "The convent taught me prayers. My grandfather taught me how to survive." "And your parents?" "My mother died when I was 16. My father died at 2 years after that, though he had stopped being a father long before the grave took him." She said it without emotion, but Caleb heard the weight underneath. He knew something about family that failed you. His own parents had died of diphtheria when he was 14, and the years since had taught him that blood didn't guarantee loyalty or love. "Sun's not at full strength yet," he said. "You stay until midday, you can fix the roof on the shed where it's leaking and mend that section of fence by the corral that's down. Then we call it even and you move on." She looked at him, those green eyes sharp and measuring. "And if I stay past midday, what then?" "Then you're doing more work, and I start wondering why." "Fair enough." She stood wiping her hands on the borrowed trousers. "Where do you keep the roofing materials?" "Woodpile east side. Shingles are underneath, wrapped in canvas to keep them dry." She nodded and walked toward the woodpile without another word. Flint, who'd been lying near the fire, got up and followed her. Caleb watched them go, feeling something shift in his chest that he didn't have a name for. He told himself it was just surprise at finding someone competent in a world that seemed increasingly full of people who expected others to do for them. But it was more than that, and somewhere underneath all his carefully constructed walls, he knew it. He spent the morning checking his trap lines, but his mind wasn't on the work. He kept circling back toward the cabin, staying just out of sight, watching her. She found the shingles exactly where he'd said they'd be and carried them to the shed without asking for help. Then she climbed onto the roof, moving carefully but confidently, and began replacing the rotted sections. He'd half expected her to make a mess of it, but she didn't. She knew how to overlap the shingles properly, how to nail them so they'd shed water instead of collecting it. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the roof was tight and the shed was weatherproof again. Then she moved to the fence. The corral rail had come down in a windstorm 2 weeks back, and Caleb had been meaning to fix it but hadn't gotten around to it. She found wire in his supply cache and used it to secure the post, then reinforced it with scrap wood, creating a repair that was ugly but functional. Around 1 in the afternoon, as he was returning from the north trap line with 2 martins and a fox, he saw her by the chicken coop. She'd managed to catch one of the prairie chickens that roosted in the brush near the cabin, wrung its neck with practiced efficiency, and was now plucking it. Caleb approached, genuinely curious now. "Most women I've known were scared of killing things. Most women you have known probably had someone else to do it for them." She didn't look up from her work. "My grandfather taught me that if you eat it, you should be willing to kill it. Otherwise, you're just playing at life." "Your grandfather sounds like he was a smart man." "He was. He also drank himself to death after my grandmother passed, so maybe not as smart as he could have been. By the time the sun started its descent toward the western peaks, she'd made a stew from the prairie chicken wild onions she'd found near the creek, and some of his hardtack crumbled in to thicken it. The smell drew him to the outdoor fire pit like a hound on a scent. He couldn't remember the last time food smelled like that, rich and savory, instead of just fuel to keep him moving. She ladled it into 2 tin bowls and handed him one, then took the other and sat on the far side of the fire. Not close, not presuming anything. Just two people sharing a meal in the fading light. Caleb ate in silence for a few minutes. The stew was good, better than good. It reminded him of meals from before when his mother was alive, and the cabin had been full of warmth instead of just heat from a fire. "Why are they hunting you?" he asked finally. She set her bottle down. "You really want to know, or are you just being polite?" "If I was being polite, I wouldn't have asked." "Fair point." She stared into the fire for a moment, organizing her thoughts. "When I was 17, my father owed money to a man in San Francisco. $800, which might as well have been $8,000 for all the hope he had of paying it back. The man offered him a way to settle the debt. He could sell me." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "My father agreed." She continued, her voice level and calm, as if she were recounting someone else's story. "I was taken to what they called a gentleman's club, which is a pretty name for a place that buys and sells women. I was there for a year being trained for the kind of work that's not mentioned in polite company. Then they decided to move me to Portland, where I'd fetch a better price." She paused, took a breath. During the transport, a woman intervened. Mother Superior Margaret from the Convent of the Sacred Heart. I don't know how she knew or why she cared, but she got me out. Took me to the convent in Sacramento, gave me sanctuary. I lived there 8 years. Took vows. Learned to pray, to read, to teach children. Thought I was safe. "What changed?" Caleb asked, though he could already guess the shape of it. "Last month I overheard Father Donnelly talking to a stranger. The priest was corrupt, taking money to pass information. The stranger was asking about a woman who'd escaped from Victor Crane's organization 8 years ago. Father Donnelly told him where to find me. When they came for me 3 nights later, I ran. I've been running ever since." She looked at him directly now. No shame in her eyes, no plea for pity. "That's who I am and what I've done. The men hunting me work for Victor Crane. They'll keep coming because to him, I'm not a person. I'm an investment he never got to cash in." Caleb set his bowl aside. He'd spent 5 years learning to read tracks, to understand what the shape of a hoof print or the depth of a boot heel could tell him about
Jacob,
the
your
person
pause
who'd
words
made it.
carry weight. You
He'd
feel
gotten
that call?
equally good at
Slant
reading
test men.
faces, at seeing the
Your time
truth
is coming.
underneath the words. This woman wasn't lying. Every word rang with the flat honesty of someone who'd stopped caring what anyone thought because the truth couldn't make things worse. "And you think these mountains will hide you?" he asked. "No." She shook her head. "I think that if I have to die, I'd rather die standing up and fighting than on my knees begging." The mountains just seemed like a good place to make that stand. It was the last part that got him, not the tragedy of her story, though, that was real enough. Not even her courage in running, though, that took its own kind of strength. It was the simple fact that she wasn't asking him to save her. She was asking for a place to make her stand and willing to work for even that much. Caleb thought about Emma Hartwell, the banker's daughter, and Helena, who'd promised to marry him and then decided he wasn't refined enough for her ambitions. Emma had wanted to be saved from a boring life, wanted him to be something he wasn't. This woman just wanted the chance to fight her own battle. "Middays passed," he said finally. "I know. But if you stay, you work, not as a guest, as a partner. Share the labor, share the risks if they come looking." She studied his face, searching for something. "Why would you do that?" "Because I've got more space than I need and more work than I can handle. And because—" He paused, searching for words that had never come easy. "Because sometimes the right thing to do is the hard thing, and I've gotten too comfortable doing the easy thing." "What do I call you?" she asked. "Caleb. Caleb Morrison." "Catherine. Catherine Brennan." They didn't shake hands, didn't seal it with any gesture beyond a nod. But something had shifted between them. An invisible line had been crossed, and both of them felt it. That night, Catherine moved her few belongings from the shed into the cabin. Caleb gave her the cot in the main room and took the smaller space in the loft. It wasn't proper by any measure of civilization, but civilization was 50 miles away and getting farther every day. Before he climbed up to sleep, he opened his ledger again. September 12th. Woman arrived, none, running from something. One night, then decide. He crossed out the last sentence and wrote instead, staying partner. See how long that lasts. He closed the book, listened to the soft sound of her breathing below, and realized that for the first time in 5 years, the cabin didn't feel empty. Outside, Flint lay across the threshold, guarding both of them now instead of just one. The days took on a rhythm the way all days did in the mountains when survival depended on routine. They woke before dawn, worked until the light failed, and spoke only when words were necessary. It wasn't silence born of discomfort, but rather the comfortable quiet of two people who understood that some things didn't need saying. On the second morning, Caleb taught Catherine how to check the trap lines. They walked the eastern circuit first, the one closest to the cabin. He showed her how to read the forest floor, how to tell the difference between deer tracks and elk, how to spot the subtle disturbance in pine needles that meant a predator had passed through. You step quiet, he observed as they moved through the underbrush. Most people crash through like they're angry at the ground. My grandfather used to take me hunting, she said, taught me that the forest doesn't care if you're there, but it will ignore you better if you don't make a fuss. At the first trap, they found a beaver, freshly caught and already dead from the cold. Caleb reset the trap while Catherine watched, memorizing the process. By the third trap, he let her do it herself. She fumbled with the mechanism at first, but her hands learned quickly. If you do this wrong, you'll lose fingers, he said, not unkindly. Best to get it right the first time. Then I'll get it right. She did. That afternoon, they processed the pelts. It was messy work, scraping flesh and fat from the underside of the hides, treating them with a mixture of brain matter and ash that smelled awful but preserved the leather. Catherine didn't flinch from it. Her hands, though blistered from the first day's work, grew steadier with each hide. You learned this from your grandfather, too? Caleb asked. Some. The nuns taught me the rest, believe it or not. We had a small farm at the convent. Someone had to know how to process the animals we raised. She paused in her scraping. They said work was prayer. I never understood what they meant until now. What do you understand? That when your hands are busy, your mind gets quiet, and sometimes that's the best prayer there is. The third day, she made bread. Real bread, not the hardtack Caleb had been subsisting on for months. She'd found his sourdough starter neglected and nearly dead in a crock in the corner, and somehow coaxed it back to life. The smell of baking filled the cabin, and when Caleb returned from checking the northern trap line, he stood in the doorway for a full minute, just breathing it in. Last time this place smelled like that, my mother was alive, he said quietly. Catherine looked up from where she was pulling the loaf from the small oven. How long ago was that? 11 years. Feels like longer. She didn't offer condolences or empty words, just cut him a thick slice still warm and handed it over. They ate in companionable silence, and Caleb thought that maybe this was what partnership was supposed to feel like. Not grand gestures or passionate declarations, but the simple act of sharing bread you'd both help create. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun paint the peaks in shades of amber, and Rose Flint came and laid his head in Catherine's lap. She scratched behind his ears absently, and the wolf dog's tail thumped against the porch boards. He's never done that with anyone but me, Caleb said. Maybe he was just waiting for the right person to come along. Maybe. He hesitated, then asked the question that had been building in him for days. Why'd you really come up here? These mountains this far from anywhere? Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her hands still moving through Flint's fur. Because I heard that mountain men lived alone and didn't ask questions. And I thought if I could find one far enough from civilization, maybe I could buy myself some time before they found me. That's all. No. She looked at him, then her green eyes reflecting the last of the day's light. I also thought that if they did find me, at least I'd die somewhere beautiful instead of in some alley in San Francisco. The honesty of it struck him like a fist to the chest. You plan on dying anytime soon. Not if I can help it. But plans don't always work out the way we hope. No, Caleb agreed. They don't. On the fourth evening, he told her about Emma. He hadn't meant to. The words just came loosened, perhaps by the whiskey he'd pulled from his stores, Or maybe by the simple fact that Catherine had shared her own story and fairness demanded he share something of his. I was engaged once, he said. Girl named Emma Hartwell. Her father owned the bank in Helena. She was pretty and refined, and I thought I was the luckiest man in Montana Territory. Catherine listened without interrupting, sensing that this was a story he needed to tell straight through. Wedding was set for November of 1876. I came back from a scouting job 2 weeks early, thought I'd surprise her, walked into her father's house, and found her in the parlor with Richard Pemberton, the town lawyer. They weren't exactly engaged in conversation. He took a drink, felt the burn. She told me I was too simple for her. Said she needed a man with ambitions, someone who could give her the kind of life she deserved. The lawyer could do that. I was just a scout who smelled like horse and leather. Did you love her? Catherine asked quietly. I thought I did. Now I think I loved the idea of not being alone more than I loved her. He set the glass down. I gave her back the ring, left Helena that night, and came up here. Been here ever since, Moskis. You didn't fight for her, Why would I fight for someone who didn't want to be fought for? He looked at Catherine. That's the difference, I think, between what she wanted and what you want. She wanted someone to make her life easy. You just want the chance to live your life at all. Catherine nodded slowly. I'm not her, Caleb. I don't want you to be something you're not. I don't even know what I want beyond tomorrow and the day after that. But I know I won't lie to you, and I won't leave unless you tell me to. That's more than most people offer, he said. They sat in silence after that, but it felt different than before, deeper somehow, like they'd crossed another invisible line and found themselves in territory neither had expected to reach. The fifth morning brought Silas Weatherby. Caleb was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard Flint's bark. Not the aggressive warning bark, but the sound the dog made when he recognized someone. A moment later, the old trapper rode into the clearing on his mule, a tough-looking animal that matched its owner's weathered appearance. Silas Weatherby was 58 years old and looked every day of it. His face was creased like old leather, his beard more gray than brown. He'd been trapping these mountains for 30 years, and he knew every creek and canyon from here to the Canadian border. Caleb, he called out, swinging down from the mule with the stiffness of a man whose joints had endured too many cold winters. Silas. Caleb set down the axe, wiping his hands. Didn't expect to see you until first snow. Wouldn't be here now, except I thought you should know something. The old man's eyes tracked past Caleb to where Catherine had emerged from the cabin, a bucket in hand. She stopped when she saw they had a visitor, then continued on toward the creek with deliberate calm. Silas waited until she was out of earshot before speaking. You got company. Helper, Caleb said. Showed up few days back. That's what I came to talk about. Silas pulled a canteen from his saddle and took a long drink. 3 men came through the trading post at Bannock 2 days ago. Asked the proprietor if he knew about a mountain man living alone north of Helena. Described you pretty well, especially mentioned the scar on your wrist. Caleb's hand unconsciously moved to cover the white line running along his right arm. They say what they wanted. Said they were looking for a woman, runaway. Said if anyone knew where she was, there'd be money in it for information. Silas spat into the dirt. One of them had a scar on his face, shaped like a hook running from his ear down to his jaw. The description hit Caleb like cold water. Dutch Carver. You know him, his brother, Roy Carver. I killed him 6 years ago during the Indian campaigns. Caleb's jaw tightened. Roy was about to shoot a Lakota boy who'd surrendered. Couldn't have been more than 12 years old. I told Roy to stand down. He turned his gun on me instead. So you shot him. Center mass. He was dead before he hit the ground. Caleb looked toward the creek where Catherine was filling her bucket. Dutch swore he'd get revenge, but I lost track of him after I left the army. Thought maybe he'd forgotten or moved on. Men like Dutch Carver don't forget, and they don't move on. Silas followed Caleb's gaze. That girl, she the one they're looking for? Probably. She worth dying for? It was a blunt question, but Silas had earned the right to blunt questions. Caleb thought about it, really thought about it before answering. I don't know yet, but I know she's worth not turning away. Silas nodded slowly as if that answer satisfied something in him. Your choice. But you should know they're not just asking questions. They're following every lead, and they're moving this direction. If they find you, they won't come friendly. How many? I counted 3 in Bannock. Could be more by now if they've hired local guns. Odds aren't great. Never are. Silas climbed back onto his mule with a grunt. You need me, you know where I am. 12 miles west, same cabin I've had for 20 years. I know, and Caleb waited until the old man looked at him. Thank you. Save your thanks until we're both alive to drink to it. The old trapper rode off and Caleb stood watching until he disappeared into the trees. Catherine was walking back from the creek, now the bucket heavy with water. She set it down when she reached him. Bad news, she asked. Complicated news. He told her about the men, about Dutch Carver, about the revenge that had been waiting for 6 years to find its target. When he finished, Catherine was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, I should leave tonight. If I'm gone, maybe they'll leave you alone. And go where, if they find you out there alone, you're dead or worse. Better than dragging you into this. I'm already in it. Caleb surprised himself with the certainty in his voice. I was in it the moment I let you stay, and I'm not turning you out now just because things got harder. Why not? You don't owe me anything. No, but I told you we were partners. Share the work, share the risks. That means when trouble comes, and it's coming, we face it together. Catherine's eyes searched his face. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you work hard. I know you don't lie. I know Flint trusts you, and that dog's a better judge of character than most people. He paused. And I know that if I send you away now, I'll regret it for the rest of my life, however long that turns out to be. Caleb, if trust is a fence, he said, remembering her words from that first evening, then we start building it by defending it together. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Then we prepare. Then we prepare, he agreed. They spent the rest of that day and the next turning the cabin into something defensible. Caleb cut down young pines and dragged them to block the 2 main approaches to the clearing. Catherine gathered stones from the creek and built a low wall on the east side of the cabin, creating cover for someone with a rifle. Caleb showed her how to set tripwires running thin cord between trees at ankle height and attaching tin cans filled with pebbles. Not enough to stop anyone, but enough to give them 30 seconds warning, which might be the difference between life and death. When you can't have an army, he told her, you need eyes everywhere. These wires will be our eyes. That evening, he taught her to shoot. They walked out to a clearing where he'd set up targets before stumps and logs arranged at various distances. He handed her his Winchester and showed her how to hold it properly, how to sight down the barrel, how to breathe and squeeze instead of pull. The first 5 shots went wide, kicking up dirt and 10 feet from the target. Catherine's jaw tightened in frustration, but she didn't make excuses. Just reloaded and tried again. The 6th shot splintered bark from the edge of a stump. Better, Caleb said. You don't need to be a sharpshooter. You just need them to know you'll shoot back. And if that's not enough, then we run. There's an old mining tunnel about 100 yards behind the cabin. Comes out near Silas's place. If things go bad, that's our escape route. You've thought this through. Survival is what I do. He paused. But I won't lie to you. 3 men, maybe more, against the 2 of us. Those aren't good odds. I've lived with bad odds before. Catherine lowered the rifle. At least this time I get to choose how I face them. That night they sat on the porch as had become their custom. The air was cold enough to see their breath, winter announcing its approach. Caleb had brought out the whiskey again, and they passed the bottle back and forth. Can I ask you something? Catherine said. You can ask. I might not answer. Fair enough. She took a sip, handed the bottle back. When you look at me, what do you see? It was an unexpected question, and Caleb took his time answering. I see someone who's stronger than she thinks she is. Someone who's been beaten down but didn't stay down. Someone who works hard and doesn't complain and makes damn fine bread. That's all? No, yeah. He looked at her directly. I see someone I'm starting to care about more than I probably should, given that we've known each other less than a week, and there are men coming to kill us. Catherine smiled a real smile that reached her eyes. Well, at least you're honest. I'm a lot of things, but I'm not a liar. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, passing the bottle, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Eventually, Catherine spoke again. Caleb, if we don't survive this, we will. But if we don't, I want you to know something. She turned to face him fully. Thank you for not turning me away, for treating me like a person instead of a problem, for these days where I got to just be Catherine instead of someone's property or someone's sin or someone's mistake. You were never any of those things. Maybe not to you, but to the world that's what I was. She reached out and took his hand, a simple gesture that felt momentous. Whatever happens, you gave me something I thought I'd lost. You gave me hope that there's still good men in the world. Caleb held her hand, feeling the calluses she'd earned in just a few days of hard work, and knew that he was standing on the edge of something. He could step back, maintain the distance, keep this simple and practical. Or he could step forward into territory he'd sworn he'd never enter again. Not after Emma, not after learning that
Jacob, your
trust was
pa's
a
words
weapon
carry
people
weight.
used against
You
you.
feel that call?
He stepped
Slant
forward.
test men. Your time is
Catherine,
coming.
I need you to know something too. I don't know what we're doing here, and I don't know how it ends. But I know that since you arrived, this place feels less like exile and more like home. And if we survive what's coming, I'd like to see where this goes. And if we don't survive, then at least I'll die knowing I didn't waste my last days being alone when I could have been with you. She leaned in and kissed him, brief and chaste, but full of meaning. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. Then I guess we better survive, she said. Inside the cabin, they made their preparations. Extra ammunition counted and distributed. Food and water stockpiled. The escape route through the back window cleared and tested. They worked side by side until exhaustion forced them to stop. And then they lay down in their separate spaces, both knowing that sleep would be difficult with the weight of what was coming pressing down on them. Just before Caleb climbed into the loft, Catherine spoke from her cot below. Caleb, yeah, I think I'm falling in love with you. I'm not sure when it started. Maybe when you taught me to set the traps. Maybe when you stood up for me even though you barely knew me. Maybe it's just that you're the first person in 10 years who's treated me like I matter. He came back down the ladder and knelt beside her cot. In the dim light of the dying fire, her face was all shadows and angles, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with strength and honesty. Catherine, I'm not easy to love. I'm quiet more than I talk. I live in a place most people would run from, and I have enemies who are coming to kill me. He paused. But I think I'm falling in love with you too. Have been since you didn't ask me to save you. Since you only asked me to stand with you. Is that enough? For tonight it's everything. He kissed her forehead, then climbed back to the loft. Below he could hear her breathing gradually slow and deepen as sleep finally claimed her. He lay awake longer, thinking about the men who were coming about Dutch Carver, and 6 years of waiting revenge about the woman sleeping below him, who had somehow become the most important thing in a carefully ordered world. In the mountains, Caleb had learned that survival meant being practical, meant making hard choices without sentiment. But he'd also learned that some things were worth the risk. Some things were worth fighting for even when the odds were bad. Tomorrow they would continue preparing. They would build their defenses and sharpen their weapons and do everything they could to improve their chances. But tonight in the quiet dark, Caleb allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt since Emma's betrayal. He allowed himself to hope. Outside, Flint padded around the perimeter of the clearing, nose to the ground, ears alert. The wolf dog knew something was coming, could sense it in the air and the way the forest felt when predators were near. But for now, the clearing was secure. For now, the people inside the cabin were safe. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles. Tonight, there was only the sound of wind in the pines, the crackle of the dying fire, and two people learning what it meant to trust again in a world that had taught them both that trust was dangerous. The mountains held their secrets close, and the future remained unwritten. But in that moment, in that cabin on the edge of the wilderness, something had taken root that would prove stronger than fear, deeper than revenge, and more enduring than the stone peaks that stood watch over them all. The porch in 1935 creaked under the weight of memory as Jacob shifted on the steps, his rucksack forgotten beside him. The sunset had deepened to purple and the first stars were beginning to pierce the darkening sky. Caleb Morrison sat motionless in his chair, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his gaze fixed on something beyond the mountains. "So you and Grandma were together then?" Jacob asked quietly. "After that first week?" The old man's mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile. "Together, yes, but not in the way you might think. We were partners, first learning to trust each other. Love came later, or maybe it was there all along, and we just needed time to recognize it. But the men who were hunting her, Jacob pressed, they came, didn't they? They came. Caleb's voice dropped, became distant. And when they did, we learned something important. Something I need you to understand before you go off to war. He turned to look at his grandson directly. Fighting alone takes courage, but letting others stand with you, that takes something harder. It takes humility. And I'd spent 5 years being too proud to need anyone. The young man waited, sensing there was more. I thought I could handle it myself, Caleb continued. Thought that's what strength meant. Being able to face everything alone. But your grandmother taught me different. She taught me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you need help. He settled back into his chair and the years fell away again, carrying them both back to the Montana territory of 1878, where winter was approaching and danger was already at the door. The morning after Silas's warning dawned cold and sharp, the kind of cold that warned of the brutal winter to come. Caleb woke before first light and lay in the loft listening to the sounds of Catherine moving below. She was already up stoking the fire preparing coffee. He could hear the quiet efficiency of her movements, the way she'd learned to navigate the cabin in near darkness. He descended the ladder to find her dressed in her work clothes, her hair braided tight against her head. She handed him a cup of coffee without speaking, and they stood together by the fire, letting the warmth drive away the night's chill. We should inventory everything, she said finally. Ammunition, food, water. Know exactly what we have if we need to hold out. Caleb nodded, impressed but not surprised by her tactical thinking. Already did the ammunition last night after you fell asleep. 40 rounds for the Winchester 15, for the Sharp 60, for the revolvers, plus the hunting knife and axe. Food. 3 weeks if we ration, less if we're feeding more than 2. You think Silas will come back? If things go bad, yes, he's not the kind to leave people to die. Caleb set down his coffee. But I'm hoping it doesn't come to that. They spent the morning fortifying their position. Caleb showed Catherine how to create proper firing positions behind the stone wall. She'd built angles that would give them coverage of the main approaches while keeping them protected. She absorbed the information quickly, her mind organizing it into a tactical framework that would have impressed a cavalry officer. You think like a soldier, he observed. I survived a year in Crane's compound by thinking 3 steps ahead, she replied. Learning to anticipate what men would do before they did it. This isn't much different. By midday, they'd created something defensible, not impregnable, but strong enough to give them a fighting chance. Caleb was checking the tripwires one final time when Catherine called out from the cabin, "Rider coming, fast!" He grabbed the Winchester and moved to the porch. A moment later, a horse burst from the tree line, and Caleb recognized Maggie Cooper, the 13-year-old daughter of the homesteaders who lived 8 miles south. She rode like demons were chasing her blonde braids, flying, her face flushed with exertion and fear. "Mr. Morrison," she shouted, pulling her pony to a sliding stop. "Miss Catherine," Caleb caught the pony's bridle, steadying it. "Maggie, what's wrong?" The girl was crying, tears streaming down her face. "They came to our house last night, 5 men. One had a terrible scar, like someone tried to cut his face open. They asked Pa if he'd seen a woman traveling alone. Pa said no, but the man, he didn't believe him. He put his gun to Tommy's head." Catherine had emerged from the cabin and now stood frozen on the porch, her face pale. "Tommy's only 8, Maggie continued, her voice breaking. "The man said if Pa was lying, he'd come back and burn our house with all of us inside. He said it real calm, like he was talking about the weather." Caleb's jaw tightened. Using children as leverage was the mark of a man without honor, but it was also effective. Fear spread faster than fire in these isolated communities. "Maggie, listen to me." He knelt to her eye level, keeping his voice steady. "You need to ride home right now. Tell your father to pack up your family and head to Helena. Don't take much, just what you need. Go to Father McKenna at St. Mary's Church. Stay there until you hear it's safe. But Pa said if you need help, we'd stand with you. Your Pa's a brave man, and I appreciate that. But the best help you can give us right now is keeping your family safe. Understand?" The girl nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Catherine descended from the porch and pulled a scrap of paper from her pocket, writing quickly. "Give this to your mother," she said, pressing the note into Maggie's hand. "Tell her God protects the innocent and you aren't innocent. Go now and don't stop for anything." Maggie took the note, gave them both one last frightened look, then wheeled her pony and galloped back the way she'd come. They watched until she disappeared into the forest. "They're using fear," Catherine said quietly, "making examples, turning everyone against us before they even get here." "It's smart." Caleb turned back to the cabin. "Isolates us, makes sure no one will help when the time comes." "So what do? We make sure they know we're not easy prey." That night the first probe came. Caleb was on watch, sitting on the porch with the Sharps rifle across his knees when one of the tripwires sang its warning. The tin cans rattled a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the mountain quiet. He was on his feet instantly, rifle raised, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The forest was still, almost too still, the way it got when humans were near, and every animal had gone to ground. "Catherine," he called softly, "we have company." She emerged from the cabin with the Winchester, moving to the position they had prepared behind the stone wall. Flint stood between them, hackles raised, a low growl building in his chest. They waited. Minutes stretched. Then Caleb saw a flash of movement near the eastern approach. Someone testing their defenses, seeing how alert they were. He didn't fire. Ammunition was precious, and he wanted them to wonder, to worry about what he might be holding in reserve. Instead, he simply watched, letting whoever was out there know they'd been seen. After 10 minutes, the presence withdrew. Caleb could feel it more than see it, the way the forest relaxed slightly when the immediate threat passed. "They're probing," Catherine said, "seeing what we've got. And now they know we're awake and ready." Caleb lowered the rifle, "which means they'll try something different next time." The next morning brought a more direct message. Caleb was checking the eastern trap line when he found it. A deer carcass, gutted and hung from a tree, blood still fresh and dripping. Pinned to the animal's flank was a note written in crude, blocky letters. "Mountain Man, send out the whore and we leave peaceful. Keep her and everyone you know bleeds. DC." Caleb tore down the note and burned it before returning to the cabin. He didn't mention it to Catherine, didn't want her carrying the weight of that particular threat. But she saw his face and knew something had changed. "What did they do?" she asked. "Doesn't matter, they're trying to scare us." "Is it working?" He looked at her directly. "No, is it working on you?" "No." Her voice was steady. "I'm done being scared of men like that." That afternoon, the shooting started. 3 shots fired from the tree line 200 yards out. They weren't trying to hit anything. The bullets impacted the cabin walls well away from the windows. This was psychological warfare, reminding them that they were surrounded, that safety was an illusion. Silas returned fire with the Sharps, the big rifle's boom echoing across the clearing. Caleb heard a scream from the forest, followed by the sound of someone crashing through underbrush. "Got one," the old man said with grim satisfaction. "Wounded, not dead, but he'll think twice before getting close again." Caleb hadn't heard Silas arrive, but he wasn't surprised. The old trapper had a way of appearing when he was needed most. "How many?" Caleb asked. "Counted 5 distinct positions. Could be more." Silas settled into a firing position behind the stone wall. "They're being cautious, professional. This isn't just Dutch and some random hired guns. These men know what they're doing. Then we need to be smarter." The siege settled into an uneasy rhythm. The attackers would probe, test their defenses, fire occasional shots to keep them on edge. Caleb, Catherine, and Silas rotated watch shifts, trying to stay alert while conserving their strength. Food and water were rationed. Sleep came in brief, fitful intervals. On the 3rd day, Catherine was on watch when she saw movement at the edge of the clearing. Not an attack, but a single man walking forward with a white cloth tied to a stick. "Caleb," she called, "someone's coming in to talk." He joined her at the window, rifle ready. The man was tall and lean, maybe 40 years old, with a scar that ran from his left ear down to his jaw in a distinctive hook shape. Dutch Carver. He stopped 40 yards from the cabin, hands visible and empty. "Mountain Man," he called out, "I'm here to parley. No weapons drawn." "You've got 30 seconds, Caleb shouted back. "Talk from there." "This doesn't have to be complicated. Victor Crane paid me $1,000 to bring back the woman. You give her up, I ride away, and you get to keep living in your mountain paradise. Simple business transaction." "She's not for sale." Dutch's smile was cold even from this distance. "Everything's for sale, Morrison. Even you sold your soul once when you shot my brother in the back. Caleb stepped onto the porch rifle, aimed but not threatening. Not yet. I shot Roy in the chest while he was aiming at a surrendered boy. I gave him the chance to stand down. He chose poorly. And I'm giving you a choice now. Her life or yours and everyone you love. I don't have anyone I love, Caleb lied. No, Dutch's voice carried a note of amusement. What about that old man in there with you, Silas Weatherby? I did some asking around. Found out what happened to his niece Sarah 20 years back. Tragic story. Comanche raiders took her when she was just 12 years old. Never found her body. Caleb felt Silas tense behind him, but didn't turn around. Shame if history repeated itself, Dutch continued. Maybe I'd take your woman the same way they took his girl. Slow, painful. Make it last. The gunshot came from inside the cabin. Catherine's Winchester barked once, kicking up dust at Dutch's feet. He jumped back, then laughed. There's some fire in her, he called out. Mr. Crane will enjoy breaking that. I'm not anyone's property, Catherine shouted from the window. Not Crane's, not yours. You want me? You'll have to kill me first. Dutch's expression hardened. As you wish, sister. We'll be back when you're hungry and tired and starting to make mistakes. And when we come, there won't be any more talking. He walked back into the forest and the clearing fell silent again. Inside the cabin, Catherine was shaking the rifle, trembling in her hands. Caleb took it gently from her and set it aside, then pulled her into his arms. Good shot, he said quietly. I wanted to kill him. I know, but we need him to underestimate you. Let him think you're just scared. It'll make him careless. Silas had moved to the window, staring out at the trees where Dutch had disappeared. His weathered face was unreadable, but Caleb could see the tension in his shoulders. Silas, he said carefully, what Dutch said about Sarah was true. The old man's voice was flat. Comanche took her from my brother's homestead in 1858. She was visiting for the summer. They killed my brother and his wife, took Sarah and 2 other children. We tracked them for 3 weeks, but we never caught up. Found the other children eventually. Not Sarah. I'm sorry. Don't be. Silas turned to face them. I spent 20 years thinking it was just bad luck, wrong place, wrong time. Found out different last year. Man I knew from the fur trade was dying, wanted to clear his conscience. Told me there was a trader who used to broker deals with the Comanche. Would tell them when homesteads were vulnerable when the men were away, in exchange for a cut of whatever they took. Who was the trader? But Caleb already knew the answer. Young man back then, called himself Dutch, had a brother named Roy. Silas's hands clenched into fists. Dutch Carver sold my niece to the Comanche for 3 bottles of whiskey and a horse. I've been looking for him ever since. Catherine's face was pale. So this isn't just about me. It's about revenge. It's about justice, Silas corrected. And yes, it's personal. But that doesn't change what we're doing here. You're innocent, Catherine. Sarah was innocent. Some things are worth fighting for even when the fight's been waiting 20 years. The revelation hung heavy in the air. What had been a simple matter of protecting Catherine had become something larger, more complex. 3 people, each carrying their own wounds, standing together against
Jacob,
men
words
who
carry
dealt in
weight.
human suffering
that
like
call?
it was currency.
Slant test men.
Then
Your
we
time is
don't
coming.
just defend, Caleb said slowly. We make them pay. That night, they formulated a plan. If Dutch and his men wanted a siege, they'd give them one. But not on Dutch's terms. They'd be smart, tactical, make every bullet count. Silas used his knowledge of the terrain to identify positions where they could set up crossfire. Catherine, with her experience anticipating men's actions, helped them predict likely attack patterns. Caleb, drawing on his scout training, planned fallback positions and escape routes. They worked through the night, moving quietly, setting up their defenses. By dawn, they'd transformed the area around the cabin into a tactical maze. Anyone trying to approach would have to navigate through carefully constructed kill zones, tripwires, and concealed positions. But as the sun rose on the 4th day, they all knew it wasn't enough. 5 men against 3, possibly more if Dutch had reinforcements. Eventually, the attackers would probe until they found a weakness, and then they'd exploit it. We need to change the equation, Catherine said as they shared a meager breakfast of hardtack and coffee. We're thinking like defenders. We need to think like attackers. What do you have in mind? Caleb asked. We know where they're camped generally, east of here near the creek. What if we hit them first while they're still planning, still feeling safe? Silas shook his head. Too risky. We leave this position, we lose our advantage. We don't have an advantage, Catherine argued. We have fortifications, but we're trapped. They can wait us out and we all know it. But if we go on offense, if we catch them by surprise, it's suicide, Silas said flatly. It's a chance, Catherine looked at Caleb. Right now we're sitting here waiting to die. I'd rather die fighting than starve in a cabin. Caleb thought about it, really thought about it. She was right about their situation. Time favored the attackers. Every day they waited was a day closer to running out of food, running out of water, running out of luck. But there was another factor. Catherine wasn't just a victim to be protected. She was a partner with her own tactical mind and her own will. Treating her like she needed to be locked away for her own safety was exactly what Crane had done, what Dutch wanted to do. And Caleb refused to become another man who took away her choices. We scout first, he said finally. Careful. If we can identify their camp, find out exactly how many there are, then we decide. But we don't commit to anything until we know what we're walking into. Catherine nodded, accepting the compromise. That evening, as Silas took the first watch, Caleb and Catherine sat together in the cabin's main room. The fire had burned down to embers, casting barely enough light to see by. They'd been living on adrenaline and fear for days now, and the exhaustion was starting to show. I haven't thanked you, Catherine said quietly. For what? For not treating me like I'm made of glass. For listening when I have ideas instead of just assuming I need to be protected. You've proven you can handle yourself. Caleb shifted to look at her directly. Besides, this is your fight as much as mine. Maybe more. You deserve a say in how we wage it. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. Caleb, I need to tell you something. Something I should have said before. What? I think I might be pregnant. The words hit him like a physical blow. He sat frozen, processing what she just said, trying to organize the chaos of thoughts and feelings that erupted in his chest. You're sure? He asked finally. As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor. I've been sick every morning for the past week, and I know my body well enough to recognize the signs. She looked down at their joined hands. I'm sorry. I know this complicates everything. Sorry, Caleb found his voice, found the words he needed. Catherine, you have nothing to apologize for. If you're carrying my child, then we're not just fighting for us anymore. We're fighting for all of us. If they take me, if Dutch gets what he wants, they won't. He said it with absolute conviction. I promise you, Catherine, they won't take you. They won't take our child. Whatever I have to do, however hard the fight gets, I'll keep you both safe. She leaned against him and he wrapped his arms around her, feeling the slight tremor that ran through her body. Fear, yes, but also relief at having shared the burden. We need to end this soon, she whispered, before I start showing, before it becomes obvious. We will. Caleb rested his chin on top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair, wood smoke and pine. I swear to you, we will. The next morning brought a new complication. Caleb was checking the northern perimeter when he heard hoofbeats approaching fast. He raised his rifle, then recognized the rider. Thomas Cooper, Maggie's father, a stocky man of 40, with a farmer's strength and a homesteader's stubbornness. Thomas, Caleb called out, you're supposed to be in Helena. Can't go. Thomas reined in his horse, breathing hard. The men there watching the roads. Got 2 of them posted on the Helena trail. Anna and the children are hidden at the Johnson's place, but I came back. Figured you could use another gun. Caleb wanted to refuse, wanted to send the man back to his family, but the truth was they needed help. 3 guns were better than 2, and Thomas Cooper knew how to shoot. You understand what you're signing up for? Caleb asked. I understand Dutch Carver threatened my boy. Put a gun to his head and smiled while he did it. Thomas's face was hard. Man does that, he needs to answer for it. And I'm not the kind to let others fight my battles. Silas emerged from the cabin, assessed the situation with a glance. 4 guns are better than 3. But Thomas, you got a family. You die here, who takes care of them? Who takes care of anyone if men like Dutch Carver run free? Thomas countered. My kids need to know their pa stood up when it mattered, not that he hid while others bled. It was decided then. 4 of them now against at least 5. The odds were still bad, but they were better than they'd been. That afternoon, they made their move. Caleb and Silas would scout Dutch's camp, while Thomas and Catherine held the cabin. If an opportunity presented itself, they'd take it. If not, they'd gather intelligence and plan a coordinated strike. Before he left, Caleb pulled Catherine aside. "If we're not back by nightfall," he said quietly, "you and Thomas take the tunnel to Silas's cabin. From there, head to Helena. Don't wait for us." "I won't leave you." "You will if you have to, for the baby." He put his hand on her stomach, still flat but carrying their future. "Promise me." She hesitated, then nodded. "I promise." He kissed her, then hard and desperate, trying to pour everything he felt into that moment because it might be the last chance he got. "I love you," he said against her lips. "I love you too. Come back to me." "I will." Caleb and Silas moved through the forest like ghosts, using every trick they'd learned in decades of hunting and tracking. They found Dutch's camp 2 miles east, hidden in a ravine near the creek. 5 men, as Silas had estimated, sitting around a fire cleaning weapons, talking in low voices. From their concealed position on the ridge above, they could hear snatches of conversation. "Waited long enough. Hit them tonight. Morrison's good with a rifle. Lost 2 men already. Crane wants her alive, but he didn't say nothing about Morrison." Dutch himself sat slightly apart from the others, sharpening a knife with methodical strokes. Even from this distance, Caleb could see the cold intelligence in the man's eyes. This wasn't just about revenge for Dutch. It was business. Professional. Which made him more dangerous than if he'd been driven purely by emotion. Silas tapped Caleb's shoulder and pointed. On the far side of the camp, partially hidden by underbrush, were horses, 6 of them saddled and ready, which meant there was at least one more man they hadn't accounted for. As if summoned by the thought, a 6th figure emerged from the trees. Younger than the others, maybe 25, carrying a brace of rabbits. He threw them down near the fire and started skinning them with practiced efficiency. "6," Silas whispered, "and they're planning to hit us tonight." Caleb nodded. They'd learned what they needed to know. Time to get back and prepare. They were halfway to the cabin when they heard it. Gunfire. Not the occasional probing shots they'd grown used to, but sustained fire. Multiple rifles, the boom of a shotgun shouting. They ran. Caleb burst into the clearing to find chaos. 3 of Dutch's men had attacked while the others stayed back, probably thinking Caleb and Silas were both gone and the cabin would be lightly defended. They'd been wrong. Thomas Cooper was behind the stone wall, firing methodically with his hunting rifle. Catherine was at the cabin window with the Winchester, and she was shooting to kill now, no warning shots. As Caleb watched, one of the attackers went down with a scream, clutching his leg. But the 3rd man had gotten close, was almost to the cabin door with a burning brand in his hand. Fire. They were trying to burn them out. Caleb brought up his rifle and fired in one smooth motion. The man with the torch dropped the burning wood, falling harmlessly into the dirt. The 2 remaining attackers saw Caleb and Silas and immediately retreated, dragging their wounded companion with them. The clearing fell silent, except for the sound of harsh breathing and the ringing in their ears from the gunfire. "Everyone all right?" Caleb called out. "We're good," Catherine answered, her voice shaky but strong. "They came at us hard. If Thomas hadn't been here." "But I was," Thomas said, reloading his rifle, "and we held them off." Caleb moved to where the man he'd shot lay motionless. Dead, killed instantly by the bullet that had taken him in the throat. He felt nothing looking at the body. This man had come to burn down his home with the woman he loved inside. Whatever mercy Caleb might have had died with that intention. "They'll be back," Silas said, "and next time they won't underestimate us." "Then we don't give them a next time." Caleb turned to face the others. "Tonight we end this. We take the fight to them." Catherine stepped out of the cabin, and Caleb saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not fear, not even determination. Something harder. Resolve. "What's the plan?" she asked. "We use what they think they know against them. They think we're defending, waiting for them to come to us, so we go to them instead. Hit their camp tonight while they're regrouping from this attack." "That's insane," Thomas said, but he didn't say no. "It's our best chance. They'll expect us to fortify, to dig in deeper. They won't expect an assault." Caleb looked at each of them in turn. "But I won't order anyone to do this. It's volunteer only." "I'm in," Silas said immediately. "Been waiting 20 years to face Dutch Carver. Not stopping now." "My family's not safe until he's dead," Thomas added. "Count me in." They all looked at Catherine. She met their gazes steadily. I'm coming too. Catherine, you're pregnant. You should stay guard to the cabin. I'm the reason we're in this fight. I'm not sitting it out. Her voice was iron. Besides, you need every gun you have, and I can shoot now. You taught me. Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to lock her in the cabin and keep her safe, but he'd meant what he said about this being her fight, about respecting her choices. And the truth was she was right. They needed every advantage. All right, he said, but you stay in the back positions. Long range. If things go wrong, you run. No arguments. If things go wrong, we all run, she corrected. This isn't a suicide mission. It's a tactical strike. They spent the remaining daylight hours preparing, checking weapons, planning approach, routes, discussing contingencies. When night fell, they moved out 4 figures, slipping into the darkness like the forest had birthed them. The attack came at midnight. They positioned themselves on the ridge above Dutch's camp, the same spot where Caleb and Silas had scouted earlier. Below, the campfire had burned down to coals. The men were sleeping or trying to exhausted from their own failed assault. Caleb gave the signal. Silas fired first with the sharps, the big rifle's boom shattering the night. One of the sleeping figures jerked and went still. The others scrambled for weapons, confused and disoriented. Thomas and Caleb fired next, precise shots into the chaos below. Another man went down. The remaining 4 found cover and started returning fire, but they were shooting at muzzle flashes, not targets, and their shots went wide. Catherine, positioned further back, as promised, provided covering fire when anyone tried to flank. Her shots weren't as accurate as the men's, but they didn't need to be. She just needed to keep the attackers pinned down. The firefight lasted maybe 5 minutes, though it felt like hours. When the gun smoke cleared, 3 of Dutch's men were dead or dying. 2 had fled into the forest, and Dutch himself was nowhere to be seen. Where is he? Silas demanded, scrambling down into the camp. Where's Dutch? They searched the area but found no trace. Then Caleb saw the tracks leading away from camp, made in haste, heading west, back toward the cabin. He circled around, Caleb said, ice flooding his veins. While we were here, he went for the cabin. They ran, abandoning stealth for speed, crashing through the underbrush in desperate haste. But even as they ran, Caleb knew they'd made a terrible mistake. Dutch had outsmarted them, used their own aggression against them. When they reached the cabin, they found it intact. No fire, no damage. But something felt wrong. Flint wasn't on the porch where they'd left him. The door stood slightly ajar. Caleb entered, first rifle ready, and his heart stopped. The cabin was empty. Catherine's rifle lay on the floor. There were signs of a struggle, a broken chair, scattered belongings, and pinned to the table with a knife was a note. You want her back, come to Helena, St. Mary's Church. Dawn tomorrow. Come alone, or she dies slow. Silas read over his shoulder, cursed viciously. It's a trap. Of course it's a trap. Caleb's voice was hollow. But I'm going anyway. Then we all go, Thomas said. End this for good. They rode through the night, pushing their horses hard. 30 miles to Helena, and every mile felt like a knife twisting in Caleb's gut. He kept seeing Catherine's face, kept thinking about the child she carried, about all the promises he'd made to keep her safe. He'd failed. The one thing she'd needed from him, and he'd failed. As dawn broke over the eastern peaks, they reached Helena's outskirts. The town was just beginning to wake, smoke rising from chimneys, the first businesses opening their doors. St. Mary's Church stood at the north end of town, a whitewashed building with a simple wooden cross. Caleb could see horses tied outside, Dutch's men waiting. What's the play? Silas asked. Caleb thought fast. Dutch wanted him to come alone, which meant Dutch planned to kill him and take Catherine anyway. But if they all went in, it would turn into a bloodbath that could kill innocent townspeople, unless they had another option. We need the law, he said. Sheriff Dalton, he's honest, and he owes me from when I tracked those horse thieves for him last year. They found the sheriff at his office, a weathered man in his late 40s with intelligent eyes and a reputation for being fair but firm. Caleb explained the situation quickly, not bothering to embellish or plead. Dalton listened, then stood and buckled on his gun belt. Dutch Carver's wanted in 3 territories for trafficking and murder. If he's in my town, I got cause to arrest him, but I need to do this legal. What do you need, Caleb asked. Proof, witnesses, something I can take to a judge. I can testify, a voice said from the doorway. They turned to see Father McKenna, the Irish priest from St. Mary's. He was a slight man in his 50s with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who'd seen both the best and worst of humanity. "The woman came to my church last night," Father McKenna said, "dragged in by armed men who showed no respect for the sanctity of the place. They're holding her in the rectory using the house of God as a prison." "That's enough for me," Dalton said. "Father, you willing to testify to what you saw?" "I am, and more. The man leading them, the one with the scar, he told me his name was Dutch Carver. Bragged about it like the name should frighten me." Dalton smiled grimly. "Then let's go have a conversation with Mr. Carver about respecting the law." They moved as a group toward the church. Dalton in front, badge visible. Father McKenna beside him. Caleb, Silas, and Thomas following, hands near weapons, but not drawn. Legal, but ready. Dutch was waiting on the church steps with two of his remaining men. He saw them coming and his smile was cold and confident. "Morrison, didn't expect you to bring the law." "Dutch Carver," Dalton called out, "I'm arresting you for kidnapping, trafficking, and murder. Step away from the church and put your hands where I can see them." "On what evidence?" Dutch's hand rested casually on his revolver. "On the word of Father McKenna here, who witnessed you holding a woman against her will on church property." "The woman's property of Victor
Jacob,
Crane.
your pa's
I'm
words
just collecting
carry weight.
what's owed."
You feel that call?
Dutch pulled
Slant
papers from
test
his
men.
coat.
Your time
"Got
is coming.
documentation right here. Signed contract from her father, legal and binding." "Let me see those," Dalton said, stepping forward. Dutch handed them over. The sheriff examined them carefully, his expression neutral. Then he looked up. "These papers might be legal in California, but in Montana territory, we don't recognize debt bondage or contracts that sell human beings. And I got a priest here who says you're holding her by force." "She's married now," Caleb said, playing the card they'd discussed. "Married to me. Legal witness documented." Dutch's confidence flickered. "You're lying." "I'm not." But he was, and they both knew it. Catherine wasn't his wife yet. But if Dalton could buy them time, if they could get her free, "Then show me the papers," Dutch demanded. Before Caleb could answer, the church door opened. Catherine stepped out, and Caleb's heart nearly stopped. She was pale, her hands bound, but her eyes were clear and fierce. Behind her came a young man Caleb didn't recognize, holding a gun to her back. "Enough talking," the young man said. "We're leaving with the woman. Anyone tries to stop us, she dies right here." Everything happened at once. Dalton's hand moved toward his gun. Dutch drew his revolver. The young man's finger tightened on the trigger, and Catherine slammed her head backward into the young man's face. The gun fired the bullet going wild, and Catherine was diving to the side. Caleb had his rifle up and was firing before conscious thought caught up with action. His bullet caught the young man in the shoulder, spinning him around. Dutch fired at Dalton, missed. The sheriff returned fire, hit one of Dutch's men in the leg. Silas's sharps boomed, and Dutch's second man went down hard. Dutch Carver found himself surrounded. Wounded men on the ground, the sheriff and his deputies with guns drawn, and Caleb Morrison advancing with murder in his eyes. "It's over, Dutch," Dalton said. "Drop your weapon." For a moment it looked like Dutch might try anyway. His finger was on the trigger, the gun pointed at Catherine where she lay on the church steps. Then his eyes found Silas, found the old man's face, and something passed between them. Recognition. Understanding. Justice delayed but not denied. Dutch lowered his gun. "All right, but this isn't done. Crane will send more men. He always does." "Crane's about to have bigger problems," Dalton said. "I'm sending telegrams to every lawman in California about his operation. Man's going to be too busy running to worry about one woman who got away." As deputies moved in to secure the prisoners, Caleb ran to Catherine. He cut her bonds, pulled her into his arms, and for a moment the whole world consisted of nothing but her heartbeat against his chest and the knowledge that she was alive. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered. "Not that easy to get rid of me." Her voice was shaky but strong. "Is it really over?" "Not quite." Caleb pulled back enough to see her face. "There's something I need to do, something I should have done days ago." He dropped to one knee there on the church steps with half of Helena watching and Dutch Carver being dragged away in chains. "Catherine Brennan," he said, "I know this isn't how it's supposed to be done. I know I should have flowers and a ring and pretty words. But what I have is this: I love you. I want to build a life with you. I want to raise our child together. And I want to do it right, legal and proper. Will you marry me?" Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Yes, yes, 1,000 times, yes. Father McKenna cleared his throat. Well then, shall we make this legal right now? I believe the church is available. And so in the small, whitewashed church in Helena, Montana, with the dawn light streaming through the windows, Caleb Morrison and Catherine Brennan were married. Sheriff Dalton served as witness, along with Silas and Thomas. It wasn't the wedding either of them had imagined, but it was real and it was theirs. When Father McKenna pronounced them married, when Caleb kissed his wife for the first time as her husband, he felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for years. This was what he'd been looking for without knowing it. Not just someone to stand beside, but someone to build with. Someone who made him better, stronger, more whole. Outside the church, they found their horses and prepared to head back to the mountains. Dutch and his men were locked in the town jail awaiting trial. The threat was over, at least for now. As they rode out of Helena, Catherine reached over and took Caleb's hand. What happens now? She asked. Now we go home. We rebuild the cabin if it needs rebuilding. We prepare for winter and for the baby. We live. He squeezed her hand. We just live, Catherine. Together. Behind them, the town of Helena fell away. Ahead, the mountains rose eternal and unchanging. And somewhere in that vast wilderness was a small cabin that had stopped being exile and become home. Silas rode up beside them. You two did good. Real good. Thank you, Caleb said, for everything, for standing with us. That's what family does. The old man's face creased into something almost like a smile. And you two are family now, you and the young one on the way. They rode in companionable silence for a while, letting the peace of the mountains settle over them. The fight was over. The future was uncertain, but full of possibility. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Caleb Morrison felt something he'd almost forgotten. He felt hope. Back on the porch in 1935, Caleb's voice trailed off. Jacob sat motionless on the steps, completely absorbed in the story. So you married her? The young man said, finally. Right there in Helena. Right there, Caleb confirmed. Best decision I ever made, even if the circumstances were less than ideal. And Dutch Carver, what happened to him? Hanged 3 months later after trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming once people started talking. Turned out he'd been trafficking women and children for 20 years, using his contacts with various tribes and criminal organizations. Caleb's voice was flat. Justice came late, but it came. And Grandma Catherine, the baby. That, Caleb said, is a story for tomorrow. Right now you need to get some sleep. You've got a long journey ahead of you. Jacob stood reluctantly picking up his rucksack, but before he went inside, he turned back to his grandfather. Thank you for telling me this, for trusting me with it. You needed to hear it, because where you're going, you will face choices about what kind of man you want to be. And I want you to remember that strength isn't about standing alone. It's about knowing when to let others stand with you. The young man nodded, then disappeared into the cabin. Caleb sat alone on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one, remembering a time when the future had seemed impossible, and love had seemed like a weakness instead of the strength it truly was. Tomorrow he would finish the story. Tomorrow Jacob would leave for war and whatever fate awaited him there. But tonight the mountains stood watch, and the memories of a love that had lasted 42 years kept an old man company in the gathering dark. The morning sun had barely crested the peaks when Jacob emerged from the cabin, his rucksack packed and ready. Caleb was already on the porch, 2 cups of coffee steaming in the cold air. The old man handed one to his grandson, and they stood together, watching the light paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. You sleep? Caleb asked. Some. Kept thinking about Grandma Catherine, about what happened after Helena. Jacob took a sip of coffee. You said you'd finish the story. Caleb nodded slowly. I will. But first I need you to understand something. The fighting, the drama, all of that, that was just the beginning. The real story, the one that matters, comes after. After you got married. After we chose to build instead of just survive. The old man settled into his chair. See, any fool can fall in love during a crisis. Danger makes everything feel more intense, more important. The real test is what happens when the danger passes and you're left with just each other and the work of making a life. He closed his eyes and the years fell away once more, carrying them both back to the autumn of 1878, when a young man and woman rode away from Helena with their future uncertain, but their commitment absolute. The ride back to the cabin took 2 days. They moved carefully, stopping frequently to rest the horses and to make sure they weren't being followed. Dutch's remaining men were in custody or scattered to the winds, but caution had become habit, and neither Caleb nor Catherine was ready to let their guard down completely. Silas and Thomas rode with them, and the four of them made camp that first night in a sheltered valley Caleb knew well. They built a small fire, cooked the provisions they'd bought in Helena, and talked quietly about what came next. "I need to get back to my family," Thomas said. "Make sure Anna and the children know it's home, do it safe. But if you need help rebuilding Caleb, you just send word." "Appreciate that." Caleb glanced at Catherine, who sat close beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "We'll probably take you up on it come spring. Cabin needs expanding if there's going to be a baby." "More than one if I know anything," Silas said with a rare smile. "You two strike me as the type to have a house full before it's done." Catherine laughed, and the sound carried across the valley like music. It was the first time Caleb had heard her laugh without reservation, without the shadow of fear darkening it. The sound did something to his chest, made it tight and full at the same time. That night, after Silas and Thomas had bedded down, Caleb and Catherine sat by the dying fire. She leaned against him, and he wrapped his coat around both of them against the mountain cold. "Are you scared?" she asked quietly. "About the baby, about all of it?" "Terrified," he admitted. "I don't know the first thing about being a father. My own died when I was 14. Don't have much to model it on. My father was a drunk and a gambler who sold me for whiskey money." Catherine's voice was matter of fact. "So neither of us has a great template. I suppose we'll just have to figure it out as we go. We're good at that, figuring things out." "We are." She turned to look at him, her face illuminated by the firelight. "Caleb, I want to tell you something. Something I haven't said to anyone in 10 years. "What?" "I'm happy. Right now in this moment, I'm actually happy." Her eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling. "I didn't think I'd ever feel that again. Thought Crane and his men had broken something in me that couldn't be fixed. But sitting here with you, knowing our child is growing inside me, knowing we're building something real, I'm happy." Caleb kissed her forehead, her cheeks finally her lips. "Then I'm doing something right." "You're doing everything right." They reached the cabin the next afternoon. Caleb's heart sank when he saw it. The attack had left damage he hadn't fully registered in the chaos. Bullet holes pocked the walls. One window was shattered, and part of the porch railing had been torn away. The shed was untouched, but the outdoor workspace was a mess of scattered equipment and overturned supplies. "It's not as bad as it looks," Catherine said, reading his expression. "Most of this is cosmetic. The structure's sound." She was right, he realized. The bones of the place were good. Everything else could be fixed with time and work. "First thing, we patch that window before the cold gets in," he said. "Then we clean up, take inventory of what's damaged and what's salvageable." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening. Silas helped them board up the broken window temporarily, then rode on toward his own cabin with a promise to check in come first snow. Thomas left at sunset, eager to reunite with his family. As darkness fell, Caleb and Catherine stood in the cabin they now shared as husband and wife. It smelled of gun smoke and cold air, and everything was slightly askew from the violence that had passed through. But it was theirs, and it was standing, and that was enough. "I should cook something," Catherine said, surveying the limited supplies. "Or we could just sleep." Caleb pulled her close. "It's been a long few days. Food can wait until morning." "Sleep sounds perfect." They lay down together on the cot, fully clothed against the cold, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Flint, who'd been found hiding in the forest and had returned with his tail between his legs, curled up at the foot of the bed. And for the first time since Catherine had arrived at Caleb's door, all those weeks ago, they slept without fear, without watchfulness, without the weight of immediate danger pressing down on them. The next morning brought the real work. Caleb spent the day repairing the exterior damage, while Catherine organized the interior cleaning and restoring order to the chaos. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that came from two people who understood each other's rhythms. By evening, the cabin looked almost normal. The window was properly boarded until Caleb could get glass from Helena. The bullet holes were patched with mud and clay, and the porch was functional, if not pretty. "It'll do for now," Caleb said, surveying their work. "Come spring, we'll expand. Add a proper bedroom, maybe a second room for the baby. We have time. Catherine stood beside him, her hand unconsciously moving to her still, flat stomach. Months yet before we need to worry about that. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm that felt almost ordinary. They checked trap lines, processed pelts, prepared for winter. The first snow came in early November, just a dusting, but it was a warning. Heavier snows would follow, and when they did, the mountain would become isolated until spring thaw. Caleb taught Catherine everything he knew about surviving a Montana winter. How to read the weather in the clouds and the way the wind moved through the trees. How to preserve meat so it lasted months instead of weeks. How to keep the fire going through the long, cold nights without using up all their wood. She absorbed it all with the same focused intelligence she'd brought to everything else. Within a month, she could predict storms as accurately as he could dress a deer faster than he could keep the cabin warm with half the wood he used to burn. "You're a natural at this," he told her one evening as they sat by the fire, her mending his worn shirts. "I'm a survivor," she corrected. "There's a difference. Natural suggests talent. This is just necessity." "You're being modest." "I'm being honest." She set down the mending and looked at him. "Caleb, I need to tell you something about the baby." His heart clenched. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, but I've been thinking about names." She took a breath. "If it's a girl, I want to name her Sarah, after Silas's niece, after the girl who didn't get saved." Caleb felt something move in his chest. "You sure that's a heavy name to carry?" "All names are heavy if you think about them long enough. But Sarah means princess. Did you know that? A girl who's valued, who matters. I think that's worth carrying." "Then Sarah it is. If it's a girl." He paused. "And if it's a boy, I was thinking Thomas, after Thomas Cooper, the man who risked everything to stand with us even though he had a family to protect." "Those are good names." Caleb reached over and put his hand on her stomach. Strong names for a strong child. December came hard and fast, bringing with it the kind of snow that buried the world in white silence. They were snowed in for 2 weeks, unable to check even the closest trap lines. The cabin became their entire universe, and in that forced intimacy, they learned each other in ways that crisis had never allowed. Caleb discovered that Catherine sang when she cooked old Irish songs her mother had taught her, her voice soft and sweet. Catherine learned that Caleb talked to himself when he worked with his hands, a running commentary of observation and problem-solving that he wasn't even aware of doing. They really talked about their pasts in a way they hadn't had time for before. Catherine told him about her mother, about watching consumption slowly steal the woman's strength until there was nothing left but memories. Caleb told her about his years as a scout, about the things he'd seen that still woke him some nights, about the moral compromises that came with survival in violent times. "Do you regret it?" she asked one night. "Killing those men, during the campaigns and after?" He thought about it seriously. "I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret doing what had to be done to protect people who needed protecting. Roy Carver would have killed that Lakota boy for sport. Dutch's men would have burned us out and taken you. Sometimes violence is the only language evil understands." That's a hard truth to live with. It is, but it's the truth nonetheless. Christmas came and went, marked only by Catherine making a special meal with the last of their dried fruit, and Caleb carving her a small wooden cross to replace the one she'd lost during her flight from California. They exchanged these gifts quietly, without ceremony, but the meaning behind them was deeper than any grand gesture could convey. In late January, Catherine's pregnancy began to show. Just a slight rounding of her belly, nothing that anyone else would notice, but Caleb saw it and felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him. This was real now.
Jacob, your
Not
pause
just an
words carry
idea
weight.
or a
You
possibility,
feel that call?
but an
Flying
actual
test men.
life growing
Your
inside
time
his
is coming.
wife, depending on them both to create a world worth being born into. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked her one morning, watching her move slowly around the cabin. "Just tired, and my back aches." She smiled at his concerned expression. "It's normal, Caleb. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. Doesn't mean I have to like seeing you uncomfortable." "Well, you're going to have to get used to it. I've got 6 more months of this." February brought a break in the weather, a week of unseasonable warmth that melted the top layer of snow and made the trails passable again. Silas arrived on the third day, his mule laden with supplies he'd brought from a trading post 20 miles west. Figured you two might be running low, he said, unloading bags of flour, salt, coffee, and dried beans. And I brought something else. He pulled out a package wrapped in oilcloth and handed it to Catherine. She unwrapped it to find a bolt of soft cotton fabric in a pale yellow color. For baby clothes, Silas said gruffly. Woman at the trading post said yellow was good because it works for either boy or girl. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. Silas, this is too much. It's not nearly enough. The old man looked uncomfortable with the emotion. You two are family now. This is what family does. They invited him to stay for dinner, and over elk stew and fresh bread, Silas told them news from the wider world. Dutch Carver had indeed hanged in February, still maintaining he was just a businessman collecting what was owed. Victor Crane had disappeared, rumored to have fled to Mexico ahead of warrants in 3 states. The trafficking network was broken, at least for now. It's over then? Catherine said quietly. Seems like it. Silas looked at her kindly. You can stop looking over your shoulder now, girl. Build your life without that weight. After Silas left, Catherine sat for a long time staring at the yellow fabric. Caleb found her there as darkness fell, running her fingers over the soft cotton. What are you thinking? And he asked. That I never thought I'd get to do this. Make clothes for my own baby. Plan a nursery. Think about the future without fear. She looked up at him. I'm thinking that happiness is strange when you're not used to it, almost frightening in how fragile it feels. It's not fragile. Caleb sat beside her. It's built on solid ground, on work and honesty and choosing each other every day. That's not fragile. That's the strongest foundation there is. Spring came late that year, not arriving in earnest until mid-April. The snow melted in rushing torrents, swelling the creeks and turning the meadows to mud. But with the melt came possibility, and Caleb began the work of expanding the cabin. True to his word, Thomas Cooper arrived in early May with 2 other homesteaders bringing tools and timber and willing hands. Over the course of 2 weeks, they added a bedroom to the cabin, a proper space with a real door and a window that looked out over the mountains. They also built a small attached room that could serve as a nursery with a cradle Caleb had been working on all winter, standing ready in the corner. The women came too. Anna Cooper and 2 other homesteader wives bringing food and conversation and practical advice about childbirth and babies. Catherine soaked it all in these glimpses of normal domestic life she'd been denied for so long. Maggie Cooper, now 14 and on the cusp of womanhood herself, appointed herself Catherine's special helper. She came twice a week to assist with chores, to learn cooking and mending, and to pepper Catherine with questions about everything from marriage to faith to what it felt like to be expecting a baby. Are you scared? Maggie asked one afternoon as they worked in the garden Catherine had planted. Sometimes, Catherine admitted. But mostly I'm excited. This baby is proof that good things can come after bad things. That life continues even after you think it's over. Ma says you're the bravest woman she's ever met. Your mother's very kind, but I'm not brave. I'm just stubborn. There's a difference. By June, Catherine was unmistakably pregnant, her belly round and prominent. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone carrying precious cargo, one hand often resting on her stomach, as if to reassure both herself and the child that everything was all right. Caleb found himself watching her, constantly torn between awe at the miracle of it and terror at all the things that could go wrong. Childbirth was dangerous in the best of circumstances, and here in the mountains, far from doctors and hospitals, the risks were magnified. Stop worrying, Catherine told him one evening, catching his anxious gaze. I'm strong, the baby's healthy, and Anna's delivered 6 children of her own, plus helped with a dozen others. I'm in good hands. I just want you safe. I know. But Caleb, you can't protect me from this. This is something I have to go through, and you have to trust that I'm strong enough to do it. I do trust that. Doesn't make it easier to watch. Yet she took his hand and placed it on her belly. Under his palm, he felt movement. A flutter, then a solid thump, the baby making its presence known. Feel that oikid, Catherine's smile was radiant. That's our child, strong and active and ready to join us. Have faith. July brought heat and thunderstorms, the kind that rolled through the mountains with dramatic fury, all lightning and wind and pounding rain. Catherine loved these storms, would sit on the porch and watch them approach, her face tilted up to catch the first drops of rain. In the convent, we had to go inside during storms, she told Caleb. Mother Superior said it was unseemly for women to be out in weather. But I always wanted to feel the power of it. Well, now you can. He sat beside her, watching her watch the storm. No one to tell you what's seemly anymore. Just my husband, and he seems content to let me be strange. You're not strange, you're free, that's different. The baby came on a night in late July during one of those summer thunderstorms Catherine loved. She'd been restless all day, unable to settle, pacing the cabin with a hand pressed to her lower back. Caleb had seen enough animals give birth to recognize the signs, and he'd sent word to Anna Cooper at midday. By evening, Anna had arrived with her birthing kit and her calm competence. She examined Catherine, nodded in satisfaction, and announced that it would be tonight. First babies take their time, Anna said. Could be hours yet. Caleb, you might want to make yourself useful elsewhere. I'm staying. His voice left no room for argument. Anna looked at Catherine, who nodded. He stays. The labor lasted through the night and into the early morning hours. Caleb had thought he knew what pain looked like, had seen men wounded in battle, had watched animals suffer. But watching Catherine endure wave after wave of contractions, seeing her face twisted with effort and agony, was harder than anything he'd experienced. He held her hand, wiped her face with cool water, whispered encouragement when she had the breath to hear it. And when she screamed, when the pain became too much and she cried out in desperation, he felt each sound like a knife to his heart. I can't, she gasped at one point, exhausted beyond measure. I can't do this anymore. You can, Anna said firmly. You're almost there. Next contraction, you push with everything you have. Listen to Anna, Caleb added, his voice rough with emotion. You're the strongest person I know, Catherine. You've survived things that would break most people. You can do this. She looked at him with eyes that were more pain than comprehension, but she nodded. And when the next contraction came, she bore down with a strength that seemed impossible given her exhaustion. The baby came in a rush all at once, slipping from Catherine's body into Anna's waiting hands. For one terrible moment, there was only silence. Then cutting through the quiet and the sound of rain on the roof came a cry. Strong and indignant, the sound of new life, demanding attention. It's a girl, Anna announced, her voice warm with satisfaction. A perfect, healthy baby girl. She cleaned the infant, quickly wrapped her in one of the blankets Catherine had made from Silas's yellow fabric, and placed her in Catherine's arms. Caleb leaned over them both, looking down at the tiny face, the shock of dark hair, the eyes that would be green like her mother's. Hello, Sarah, Catherine whispered, tears streaming down her face. Hello, little one. We've been waiting for you. Caleb reached out with one rough finger and touched his daughter's tiny hand. Immediately, impossibly, her fingers curled around his, gripping with surprising strength. She's got a good grip, he said, his voice thick. That's a good sign. She's perfect, Catherine looked up at him. We made something perfect, Caleb. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks overcome with emotion too big for words. They'd created life, had brought into the world a soul who would carry their names and their hopes and their dreams into the future. In that moment, everything they'd endured, every hardship and danger and moment of fear, seemed worth it for this one small miracle. Anna stayed through the next day, making sure both mother and child were recovering well. She taught Caleb how to change the baby, how to recognize when she was hungry or wet or just fussy. She showed Catherine how to nurse patient and matter-of-fact about the mechanics of it. When Anna finally left, Caleb and Catherine were alone with their daughter for the first time. The cabin was quiet except for the small sounds Sarah made, the snuffles and sighs of an infant exploring this strange new world. I never thought I'd have this, Catherine said softly, watching Sarah sleep in the cradle beside their bed. A family, a home, a child of my own. Neither did I. Caleb lay beside his wife, careful not to jostle her still recovering body. Thought I'd live and die alone on this mountain. Thought that was all I deserved after everything I'd done. We both thought wrong. She turned her head to look at him. We get this, Caleb. We get to be happy. We get to build something good. We do. He reached over and took her hand. And we're going to teach her. Sarah's going to know she was wanted every single day of her life. She's going to know what it means to be loved without conditions. She's going to know that she matters. Yes, Catherine's eyes were already closing, exhaustion claiming her. She's going to know all of that. Caleb lay awake long after Catherine had fallen asleep, watching his wife and daughter in the lamplight, feeling the weight of responsibility and love settled over him like a blanket. He'd been a scout, a trapper, a fighter. Now he was something else. A husband, a father, a builder of futures instead of a survivor of pasts. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool. Inside, in the cabin on the mountain, a family slept. And Caleb Morrison, 26 years old and feeling ancient, knew that his life had just begun in the truest sense. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. Sarah grew from infant to toddler, all dark curls and green eyes, and a will that matched her mother's. She walked early, talked late, and showed a fierce independence that both amused and terrified her parents. When Sarah was 2, Catherine became pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and the pregnancy was easier despite the demands of caring for a toddler. The baby, a boy they named Thomas Silas, arrived in the spring of 1881, healthy and loud and blessed with his father's gray eyes. The cabin expanded again. More rooms, more space, more life. Filling every corner, Maggie Cooper, now 16, became a regular fixture, helping with the children and learning from Catherine about everything from reading to cooking to the kind of strength that didn't require muscles. Silas visited monthly, weather permitting, and it was clear to everyone that he'd adopted this family as his own. The grandchildren he'd never had the redemption for the niece he'd failed to save. He taught Sarah to track animals when she was barely 4 years old, showed Thomas how to identify edible plants before the boy could write his own name. Other homesteaders settled in the area, drawn by word that the mountains were safe now that Dutch Carver and his kind were gone. A community formed, loose and spread out, but real. There were barn raisings and harvest celebrations, shared resources, and mutual aid. The isolation Caleb had once sought became connection, and he found he didn't mind as much as he thought he would. Catherine started teaching in the winters when families were snowed in and children had time for learning. She held school 3 days a week in the Morrison cabin, teaching reading and writing and arithmetic to a dozen children of various ages. She was good at it, patient and clear, and she never turned away a child who wanted to learn, regardless of their family's ability to pay. "Education is how we change things," she told Caleb one evening, watching her students file out into the snow. "It's how we make sure the next generation has choices we didn't have." When Sarah was 5 and Thomas was 3, Catherine gave birth to their third child, a girl they named Anna Margaret, after the 2 women who'd done so much to help them build their life. Anna was quieter than her siblings, thoughtful and gentle, with her father's tendency toward observation rather than action. The cabin was full, now gloriously chaotic, with children's laughter and tears, with the mess and noise and constant motion of family life. Caleb, who'd once cherished silence above all things, found he couldn't imagine going back to it. He was 32 years old, his beard now fully gray at the temples, his body carrying the marks of hard work and harder winters. But he was happy in a way he'd never expected, to be grounded in purpose and surrounded by evidence that his life meant something beyond his own survival. On their 10th anniversary, Caleb took Catherine up to a high meadow he'd found years before, a place where wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, and you could see 3 mountain ranges from a single vantage point. They left the children with Anna Cooper for the day, rode up the mountain on the horses they rarely had time to exercise anymore, and spent the afternoon alone together. "Thank you," Caleb said as they sat in the meadow, the sun warm on their faces. "For what? For knocking on my door that evening, for not giving up, for building this life with me." Catherine smiled, the expression lighting up her face in a way that still made his heart skip. "Thank you for opening the gate, for taking a chance on a woman you had every reason to turn away. Best gamble I ever took." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands linked, watching the clouds drift across the impossibly blue sky. Then Catherine spoke, her voice thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had gone differently, if you'd sent me away that first night?" "Sometimes. Then I stop wondering because I can't bear to think about it." He turned to look at her. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Catherine Morrison. You and those 3 wild creatures we created." "4, he blinked. "What, 4 wild creatures?" She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "I'm pregnant again. About 2 months along, I think." Caleb felt joy surge through him, mixed with the familiar terror. "You're sure?" "As sure as I was with the others." She laughed at his expression. "Don't look so worried. I've done this 3 times already. I'm practically an expert." Their 4th child, a boy they named Caleb Jr., arrived in the winter of 1887. He was the loudest of all their children, demanding attention from his first breath and never letting up. He had his mother's hair and his father's stubbornness, and from the moment he could walk, he was into everything. By then, Sarah was 10 years old, tall and serious, already showing signs of the woman she'd become. She helped her mother with the younger children, taught them their letters, told them stories about the grandmother they'd never met, and the grandfather who'd saved their mother when everything seemed lost. Thomas at 8 was his father's shadow, following Caleb on trap lines, learning to shoot and track and read the mountain weather. He was quieter than his siblings, more comfortable with silence and solitude, and Caleb recognized in him echoes of his own younger self. Anna at 6 lived in books when she could get them, reading everything she could find and asking questions that made the adults pause and think. She wanted to know everything to understand how the world worked, and she had the patience to sit and learn in a way her more active siblings lacked. And baby Caleb, just learning to walk, was pure chaos wrapped in dimples and charm. The Morrison homestead had become a landmark in the region. When people needed help, they came to Caleb and Catherine. When children needed teaching, Catherine taught them. When families needed supplies or guidance or just someone to talk to, the Morrison cabin door was open. Maggie Cooper, now 24 and married to a young homesteader named William Finch, gave birth to her first child in the Morrison cabin with Catherine as midwife. The circle completed. The girl who'd once ridden for help, now receiving it, the knowledge passed down from Anna Cooper to Catherine to Maggie and beyond. Silas, now 78 and slowing down considerably, moved into a small room they'd built onto the Morrison cabin. He couldn't manage his own place anymore, and none of them could bear to see him struggle alone. He spent his days teaching the children, telling stories, and sitting on the porch watching the mountains he'd known for half a century. "Never thought I'd end my days surrounded by family," he told Caleb one evening. "Thought I'd die alone, still looking for Sarah, still carrying that weight." "You're not alone," Caleb said simply. "You're with us.
Jacob,
And
your
Sarah,
pause words
wherever
carry
she is,
weight.
I think she'd
Feel
be
that
glad
call?
knowing you
Slant
found
test
peace."
men. Your time is
Maybe.
coming.
The old man's eyes were distant. Maybe she would at that. The years accumulated like snow, quiet and steady, and transforming everything beneath their weight. Sarah grew into a young woman of remarkable strength and clarity, married at 20 to a rancher's son named David Morrison, no relation but a good man who loved her fiercely. She gave them their first grandchild in 1899, a girl named Catherine after her grandmother. Thomas became a lawman, taking a deputy position in Helena under Sheriff Dalton, now elderly but still sharp. He kept the mountains safe, kept the kind of men who'd once hunted his mother from preying on others. He married at 25, had 2 children, and visited the homestead every month without fail. Anna, brilliant and restless, went to Helena to teach at the school there, became its principal by the time she was 30. She never married, devoted to education and to the children who needed someone to believe in them the way her mother had believed in the lost and broken woman who'd stumbled into their lives. Young Caleb took over the trapping business, expanded it into a legitimate trading operation, married a quiet woman named Ruth, who balanced his boisterousness with her calm. They had 1 child, a son, and built their cabin just a mile from the original Morrison homestead. The family grew, branched out, but stayed connected. Sunday dinners at the Morrison cabin became tradition, 3 generations gathering to eat and talk and simply be together. The table Caleb had built could seat 16 when all the leaves were added, and it was rarely empty. Caleb was 60 in 1913, his beard fully white now, his body bearing the marks of a life lived hard but well. Catherine was 61, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face lined but still beautiful in the way that came from a life fully lived. They'd buried Silas 3 years before in 1910 on a hillside near the cabin where he could look out over the mountains forever. The marker was simple: Silas Henry, Weatherby, 1820 to 1910. He saved more than he lost. The children had children who had children, and the Morrison name spread through the territory like roots from a strong tree. Every one of them knew the story, how their family had started with a desperate woman and a lonely man, and a decision to open a gate instead of closing it. In 1918, the world went mad with war. Thomas Silas Morrison, 41 years old and too old for the draft, watched his eldest son march off to France and didn't know if he'd ever see the boy again. Anna's students left school to work in factories to support the war effort to grow up too fast. Young Caleb sent his boy as well, just 17 but determined to serve. The family gathered at the Morrison homestead, all of them, and prayed together for the first time in years. Catherine led the prayer, her voice still strong, asking God to watch over the young men who'd gone to fight to bring them home whole in body and spirit. The war ended. Some came home, some didn't. The Morrison family was lucky. All their boys returned, though not unchanged. The weight they carried was different than anything their parents and grandparents had known, and it took time for them to find their way back to themselves. Then came 1920, and with it the influenza pandemic that swept through the world like a scythe, cutting down strong and weak alike. It reached Montana in October, carried by travelers, and spread through communities faster than fear. Catherine caught it in early November. She'd been helping nurse sick families, bringing food and comfort to homesteads where everyone was ill, and she'd been exposed too many times to stay well. The fever came first, then the cough, then the terrible struggle for breath that characterized the worst cases. Caleb nursed her himself, refusing to leave her side despite the children's pleas that he protect himself. He was 67 years old. If he caught it, he'd likely die. But he didn't care. If Catherine was going to fight this, she wouldn't fight alone. For 2 weeks, she battled her strong body, warring with the infection that wanted to steal her away. There were moments when Caleb thought they'd won, when her fever would break and she'd smile at him and he'd dare to hope. Then it would come roaring back worse than before, and he'd sit by her bedside holding her hand and praying to a God he'd never been sure he believed in. On the 14th day, she woke lucid and clear-eyed. The fever had broken, and for a few hours it seemed like maybe she'd beaten it. "Caleb," she said, her voice weak but certain. "Come here." He sat on the edge of the bed, took her hand in both of his. "I need to tell you something," she continued, "in case I don't get another chance. Don't talk like that. You're getting better. Maybe, but just in case." She squeezed his hand with what strength she had left. "Thank you for opening the gate. Thank you for 42 years of love and partnership and building something beautiful together. Thank you for our children and our grandchildren and this life that was more than I ever dreamed possible." "Catherine, let me finish." She smiled, and even weakened by illness, it was the smile that had captured his heart all those years ago. "You made me believe in goodness again, in the possibility of happiness after horror, in love that doesn't hurt or diminish but builds and strengthens. You gave me a life worth living, Caleb Morrison, and I have loved every moment of it." He couldn't speak past the tightness in his throat, so he just held her hand and nodded. "Promise me something," she said. "Anything. When I'm gone, and I think maybe I will be soon, don't you dare waste the time you have left being sad. Live, Caleb. Be with the children and grandchildren. Tell them stories. Teach them what we learn. Show them that love is stronger than fear, that building is braver than destroying. I promise." She closed her eyes, and he thought she'd drifted off to sleep. But then she spoke one more time, so quietly he almost didn't hear it. "Thank you for opening the gate." Then she smiled, and then she slipped away so gently that at first he didn't realize she'd gone. He sat there holding her hand, waiting for her to wake up to come back to him. But she didn't. She was gone, and the cabin that had been so full of her presence suddenly felt impossibly empty. The family buried her on the same hillside as Silas, where she could look out over the mountains forever. The marker said simply, "Catherine Ann Morrison, 1852 to 1920. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, teacher." She was wanted every day of her life. The children wanted Caleb to move in with one of them, to give up the cabin and the mountain, to let them take care of him the way he'd taken care of them. But he refused. This was his home, Catherine's home, and he wasn't leaving it. Not yet. He lived 15 more years after Catherine died. 15 years of watching grandchildren become adults, of welcoming great-grandchildren into the world, of seeing the family tree branch and grow in ways he could never have imagined that first night when a desperate woman knocked on his door. He kept the cabin exactly as it had been Catherine's things, in their places, her garden still tended each spring. He wrote in his ledger every day, the same leather journal he'd started in 1878, now worn and stained and filled with the chronicle of a life. And he told the stories. To anyone who would listen, but especially to the young ones heading off into the world, he told them about trust and choice and the importance of opening gates instead of building walls, which was how on that autumn evening in 1935, he came to be sitting on the porch with his grandson Jacob, watching the sun set over the mountains, and telling the story one more time. Jacob stood at the porch rail, now his rucksack by his feet, processing everything he'd heard. The sun had set fully, and stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. That's some story, Grandpa, he said finally. It's not a story, it's the truth. Caleb pushed himself up from his chair, joints protesting. And I told it to you for a reason. What reason? Because where you're going, you'll face choices. About what kind of man you want to be. About whether to close yourself off or stay open to possibility. About whether to build or destroy. The old man put his hand on his grandson's shoulder. And I want you to remember that the most important battles aren't fought with guns. They're fought with choices. Like choosing to let grandma stay instead of sending her away. Like that, like choosing to trust even when trust is dangerous. Like choosing to build a life with someone even when you're terrified it won't last. Like choosing love over fear every single day even when fear seems smarter. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I'm scared, Grandpa, about the war, about what I might have to do, about whether I'll come back. Good. Fear keeps you smart, but don't let it keep you from living. Don't let it keep you from opening gates when the right person knocks. Caleb squeezed his grandson's shoulder. And don't let it keep you from coming home when this is done. This family, this place, will be here waiting. The young man nodded, not trusting his voice. Now go on inside, Caleb said gently. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's a big day. Jacob picked up his rucksack and headed for the cabin door. He paused on the threshold, looked back at his grandfather. I love you, Grandpa. I love you too, boy. Stay safe out there. After Jacob had gone inside, Caleb sat back down in his chair. The mountains were just dark shapes against the slightly lighter sky, now familiar forms that had watched over him for nearly 60 years. He pulled his ledger from the side table where he always kept it, opened it to the last entry. He'd written it just that morning, knowing somehow that this was the right day to share the story, the right moment to pass on what he'd learned. The entry was simple, dated January 27th, 1935. Today, I told Jacob about Catherine, about how we met, how we fought, how we built this life together. I wanted him to understand that strength isn't about standing alone. It's about knowing when to let others in. Catherine taught me that. She taught me everything that matters. Below that, in slightly shakier handwriting, he added, Tomorrow Jacob leaves for war. I'm scared for him, but I'm proud too. He's a good boy becoming a good man. He'll make the right choices when the time comes. I raised him too. He closed the ledger and set it aside. Then he sat in the darkness, listening to the wind in the pines, and let himself remember. He remembered the first time he saw Catherine silhouetted against the twilight, desperate and determined. He remembered the sound of her laugh when she finally felt safe enough to laugh. He remembered the weight of Sarah in his arms the first time he held her, impossibly small and impossibly perfect. He remembered Sunday dinners with the table full, 3 generations talking over each other, the cabin alive with love and chaos. He remembered Catherine's hand in his, calloused and strong, a perfect match for his own. He remembered the last words she'd spoken to him. Thank you for opening the gate. Caleb Morrison was 82 years old. He'd been a scout, a trapper, a fighter, a husband, a father, a grandfather, and now a great-grandfather. He'd killed men and saved them, had destroyed and built, had closed himself off, and then opened himself up to the possibility of love. And sitting there on the porch of the cabin, where he'd spent most of his adult life, where he'd raised his family and buried his wife and learned what it meant to be truly alive, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He'd do it all again exactly the same way if it meant having those 42 years with Catherine Morrison. The gate had opened, love had walked through, and everything that mattered had followed. He opened the ledger one more time, turned to the very first entry about Catherine from September 1878. Below his young self's words, he wrote in his old hand, September 12th, 1878. Woman arrived, none, running from something, one night, then decide. And below that, in the careful script of a man who wanted his final words to be clear, September 12th, 1920. Catherine Morrison died today. Wife, mother, grandmother, teacher, partner. She was the bravest person I ever knew, and she chose me. I will love her until my last breath and after. He closed the ledger for the last time and set it on the table where Jacob would find it when the time came. Then Caleb Morrison sat back in his chair, looked out at the mountains that had witnessed his entire life, and smiled. The gate had opened, and he had walked through it with courage instead of fear. That in the end was all that mattered. That and the legacy of love they'd built together, a legacy that would outlast the mountains themselves.